The conclave of 37 voices had not lost a quorum in 600 years. That record ended on the 43rd day of the Standard Galactic Year 2387, at 1422 station time, when Admiral Yara Osemensa of the Terran Unified Defense Directorate stood up from her seat, collected her data tablets with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided something long before walking into the room, and led the entire human delegation out of the chamber. No speech. No ultimatum. No dramatic pause at the doorway. Just departure. The chamber fell silent for 11 seconds. An eternity in a room designed to process the politics of 37 civilizations simultaneously. The Velhari representative, whose species communicated partly through bioluminescent skin patterns, reportedly went completely dark. The Kethansel senior diplomat, who had navigated 2 interstellar wars and a succession crisis without losing composure, asked his junior aide in a low voice, "Did they just?" The aide confirmed it. They had. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what the conclave was, and what humanity had represented within it for the past 40 years. Humanity had been the newest recognized member species of the Galactic Conclave, admitted formally in 2347 after a decade of probationary observation. They were, by almost every metric the older civilizations used to measure significance, a minor power. Their fleet was substantial but young. Their territory was a single solar system with 3 additional colony outposts. Their economic output, while growing rapidly, ranked 22nd of 37. Their military history as far as the galaxy was concerned, consisted of internal conflicts on a single planet and one very short, very sharp defense engagement against Kethansel border incursion in 2361, a conflict that had ended faster than anyone expected, and which the Kethansel preferred not to discuss in formal sessions. On paper, humanity had no reason to be taken seriously. But Admiral Osemensa had not walked out because she believed humanity would be ignored. She walked out because she had calculated, with the precision her career demanded, that staying in that room was costing more than it was worth, and that the galaxy needed to feel that cost. The session in question had been called to address the Mohari Corridor crisis. The Mohari Corridor was a navigational lane spanning approximately 4.2 light-years between the Dravali cluster and the outer edge of the Terran colonial sphere. 3 months earlier, a Dravali commercial convoy, 7 vessels carrying processed rare earth compounds and approximately 400 civilian crew, had been seized by Kethansel enforcement ships under a disputed territorial claim. The convoy was still in Kethansel holding facilities. The crew were, according to the most recent independent verification, alive and unharmed, but that status had not been independently confirmed in over 6 weeks. Humanity had a direct interest in this. 2 of the 7 seized vessels had been operating under Terran commercial registry. 11 of the 400 crew were human citizens. What happened in the council session, however, had not been a discussion about the seized vessels or the missing crew. It had been a procedural argument, a slow, grinding, technically intricate dispute about whether the conclave's jurisdictional mandate extended to enforcement actions within contested corridor space, and if so, which subcommittee held primary oversight, and whether a formal inquiry could be initiated before the jurisdictional question was resolved, or whether initiating the inquiry without resolving jurisdiction would itself constitute a de facto jurisdictional ruling that could be challenged. Under the conclave's own founding articles, this argument had been ongoing in various forms for 9 weeks. 11 human citizens had been in a detention facility for 9 weeks while 37 civilizations argued about committee structure. Osemensa had submitted 3 formal motions to accelerate the process. All 3 had been tabled pending the jurisdictional review. She had requested an emergency session under Article 14 of the Conclave Charter, which allowed for expedited deliberation in cases involving civilian detention. The request had been referred to the Rules Committee, which had not yet scheduled a meeting to review it. She had then, in the 43rd session, requested the floor for a formal statement. The session chair, a Velhari whose name translated roughly as Keeper of Deliberate Process, had informed her that the floor was currently reserved for the jurisdictional subcommittee's 3rd response to the Kethansel counterfiling, and that human delegation statements were scheduled for the following session, which would be convened at a date to be determined. Osemensa had looked at the chair for a moment. Then she had collected her tablets. Then she had left. What the galaxy was about to discover, what would take weeks to fully register across the diplomatic networks, intelligence services, and strategic planning departments of 36 civilizations, was that humanity had not walked out in frustration. They had walked out with a plan. The plan had been in development for 4 months, drafted quietly by a 12-person team within the Terran Directorate's Strategic Relations Office, reviewed by the Defense Council, and approved by the civilian government with remarkably little deliberation. Not because the government was reckless, but because when the Strategic Relations team presented their assessment of where conclave diplomacy was heading, the deliberation had essentially concluded itself. The assessment was simple. The conclave, as currently structured, was incapable of resolving crises that involved Cathansal territorial interests, because the Cathansal had spent the better part of 2 centuries embedding procedural protections into the conclave's governing documents that made timely enforcement against their actions structurally impossible. Humanity had 2 options: continue participating in a process designed to produce inaction, or create new facts on the ground that would force a different kind of calculation. They had chosen the second option. And as Osemensa's delegation stepped into the corridor outside the council chamber and her communications officer began transmitting the pre-drafted diplomatic notices to all 36 member civilizations, 3 Terran defense fleets were already moving. Not toward war. Toward something more precise, and in many ways more dangerous. The galaxy had 6 hours before it understood what humanity had just set in motion. It would need considerably longer to decide what to do about it. Fleet movement at interstellar scale is not a secret you can keep for long. The physics work against you. Ships transitioning into and out of fold space leave gravitational echoes that any civilization with a decent sensor network can detect, interpret, and track. The older species, the Velhari, the Conclave's founding members, civilizations that had been reading fold space signatures for 3,000 years, could identify a single capital ship's drive signature from 8 light-years away. They could tell you its class, its approximate tonnage, and with enough data, its likely point of origin. What they could not always tell you with certainty was intent. And it was intent, the careful, deliberate ambiguity of it, that made what humanity did in those 6 hours so difficult to immediately classify, and therefore so difficult to respond to. The 3 Terran defense fleets designated Anvil, Patience, and Ledger had not assembled suddenly. That was the first thing the Velhari strategic analysis team noted when they pulled the movement records 40 minutes after receiving the Terran diplomatic notice. The fleets had been forming up over a period of 11 weeks, gradual, unhurried, overlapping with scheduled resupply rotations and what the Terran Directorate had publicly logged as joint training exercises. In isolation, each element of the buildup looked routine. Together they told a different story. Anvil was a combat fleet. 17 warships, including 3 Terran Consolidated class carriers, the heaviest ships in the Terran inventory. Its doctrine was force projection, the kind of fleet you built when you needed to put overwhelming mass in a specific place and hold it there. It was positioned 1.4 light-years from the Mohari corridor's eastern approach, which put it inside reaction range of the Cathansal holding facilities by a margin of several hours. Patience was something else. 12 ships, smaller, faster, built around what Terran doctrine called sustained interdiction, the ability to control the movement of other vessels through a defined volume of space over an extended period. It carried no weapons capable of engaging capital ships in direct combat. It did carry enough electronic warfare capacity to make fold space transit through a roughly 6 light-year zone extremely uncomfortable for anyone trying to move logistics convoys. It was positioned across the Cathansal primary resupply lane to their outer system holdings. Ledger was the one that caused the most conversation in the analysis departments. Ledger was not a combat fleet in any conventional sense. It was 9 vessels, all modified deep space transports, positioned at the edge of Terran colonial space nearest to the Dravali cluster. Its manifest, when Velhari intelligence accessed it through their standard monitoring channels, showed it was carrying emergency medical supplies, portable habitat modules rated for long-term occupation, food processing units, atmospheric recyclers, and a staff of 214 personnel that included doctors, engineers, logistics specialists, and this detail appeared in 3 separate intelligence summaries within the same hour, 14 individuals with specializations in international detention law and prisoner processing. Ledger wasn't going to fight anyone. Ledger was going to pick someone up. The Terran diplomatic notice, which arrived simultaneously at all 36 member civilizations' receiving stations, was a model of clarity. It was 847 words long. It contained no threats, no ultimatums, and no emotional language. It was drafted in the formal register of Conclave Standard, the shared diplomatic language developed over centuries to reduce ambiguity in interspecies communication. It stated, in precise sequence, that the Terran Unified Defense Directorate had, after 43 sessions of conclave deliberation, concluded that the existing procedural framework was insufficient to address the urgent matter of detained civilians, including 11 Terran citizens, held without independent verification for a period now exceeding 6 weeks. That the Terran Directorate was, accordingly, exercising its rights under Article 7 of the Conclave Charter, the rarely invoked provision allowing member civilizations to take unilateral protective action on behalf of their citizens when the Conclave's collective mechanisms had demonstrably failed, and had positioned assets to facilitate the safe return of all detained personnel, Terran and Dravali alike. That the Terran Directorate was extending a direct communication channel to the Cathansel government for the purpose of arranging the immediate and orderly release of detained personnel, and expected a response within 48 hours. That the Terran Directorate remained a committed member of the Galactic Conclave and fully intended to re-engage with Council deliberations following the resolution of this immediate humanitarian matter. That was it. No flourish. No threat. No mention of what would happen if the 48 hours elapsed without response. The absence of that last part was, according to every diplomatic analyst who reviewed the document in the following hours, the most significant thing about it. The Cathansel government received the notice and immediately convened an emergency session of their own defense directorate. The session lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. The records, obtained later through channels that need not be detailed here, show that the primary debate was not about whether to comply, but about whether Terran fleet positioning constituted an act of aggression that could be used to reframe the situation before the Conclave. The answer their legal team provided was technically ambiguous, practically discouraging. The Terran positioning was defensive in character. Fleet Anvil was outside Cathansel space. Fleet Patience was an unclaimed corridor space, where its presence was legal under Conclave navigational law. Fleet Ledger was in Terran territory. None of it, individually or collectively, crossed the line. The Cathansel Defense Directorate asked their fleet commanders for an assessment of what engagement with Fleet Anvil would cost them. The assessment came back in 2 hours. The session adjourned without a formal decision, which in Cathansel institutional culture meant the senior directorate members were waiting to see what happened next before committing to a position they couldn't walk back. What happened next came from an unexpected direction. It came from the Dravali. The Dravali Cluster Confederacy had been, to this point, the aggrieved party with the least apparent agency, their convoy seized, their crew detained, their diplomatic protests processed through the same conclave machinery that had processed everything else into procedural stasis. They were not a major military power. They did not have a history of bold unilateral action. But at hour 19 of the 48-hour window, the Dravali Confederacy transmitted a statement, not to the conclave, not to the Cathansel, but directly to the Terran Directorate's open channel. It was 6 sentences long. It acknowledged the Terran action. It confirmed that Dravali civilian crew members were among the detained personnel. It stated that the Dravali Confederacy would consider any personnel retrieved in a Terran-facilitated operation to be under Terran diplomatic protection for the duration of their transit home. It noted that the Dravali Confederacy was prepared to offer navigation rights through Dravali space to facilitate this transit, effective immediately. And then, the sentence that was quoted in intelligence reports across the galaxy for weeks afterward, it said, "We have been waiting for someone to move." 32 hours remained on the Terran clock. And the galaxy was beginning to understand that humanity had not walked out of the conclave in frustration. They had walked out because the room had stopped being where the real decisions were made. Every civilization that reaches interstellar capability develops, eventually, a theory about what other civilizations will and will not do under pressure. The Cathansel theory of human behavior had been developed over 40 years of observation, and it was, by the standards of interstellar intelligence work, reasonably well-sourced. They had studied humanity's internal political history, their conflict patterns, their decision-making under duress. They had accumulated significant data from the 2361 border incident, the engagement that the Cathansel preferred not to discuss, and had incorporated its lessons into their revised assessments. Their theory held that humanity was, fundamentally, a civilization that preferred resolution over escalation, that would absorb significant diplomatic frustration before taking kinetic action, and that, critically, would not risk a direct confrontation with an established power over a matter as relatively minor as 11 citizens and 2 commercial vessels. The theory was not unreasonable. It was based on real data. It had been refined by serious analysts. It was also, as the next 32 hours would demonstrate, wrong in almost every dimension that mattered. The error was not in the data. It was in the framework used to interpret it. Cathansel strategic culture was organized around a principle their political philosophy called measured response hierarchy, the idea that state actions should be precisely calibrated to the scale of the provocation, and that disproportionate responses were a form of strategic weakness because they revealed emotional rather than rational decision-making. A civilization that overreacted was a civilization that could be manipulated by controlling what it reacted to. By this framework, humanity's departure from the conclave and subsequent fleet deployment was a disproportionate response to a relatively minor incident. 2 ships, 11 people, and therefore represented either emotional instability or a bluff. What Cathansel analysis had not adequately weighted was that humanity did not share this framework. Terran strategic doctrine, as understood by the Defense Directorate and the government it served, did not organize responses according to the scale of the immediate provocation. It organized responses according to the precedent being established. The 11 citizens were not 11 citizens in isolation. They were the first test of whether the conclave's mechanisms could protect Terran interests in a scenario where Cathansel institutional interests ran in the opposite direction. If the answer was no, if 11 people could be held for weeks without accountability, then the answer would also be no for the next incident, and the one after that, scaling upward indefinitely. The Terran Directorate was not responding to the size of the incident. It was responding to the size of the principle. At hour 26 of the 48-hour window, Cathansel internal communications, reconstructed later from multiple sources, show the first signs of genuine uncertainty within their directorate. The uncertainty was triggered not by Fleet Anvil, whose presence they had been monitoring and whose positioning, while uncomfortable, remained outside their territorial boundary. It was triggered by Fleet Patience. Fleet Patience had not moved toward anyone. It had not made any threatening maneuvers. It had, in fact, done almost nothing except exist in the navigational corridor that connected the Cathansel outer holdings to their primary resupply infrastructure. 17 hours after taking up its position, Fleet Patience had transmitted a single standard navigational advisory to all shipping in the area, that due to ongoing defense exercises, vessels transiting the corridor should expect minor electromagnetic interference and were advised to file updated transit plans with Terran Navigational Control. It was, on its surface, an entirely routine navigational notice of the kind that every civilization's defense forces transmitted regularly. It was also an unambiguous statement that Fleet Patience was treating that corridor as Terran navigational space, not by claiming ownership, not by any legal filing, not by any conclave process, but simply by behaving as though this were already true and inviting others to accommodate that assumption. The Cathansel outer holdings moved approximately 400,000 tons of material through that corridor every standard month. The outer holdings included their primary deep space research installations and 3 significant colonies whose food security depended on regular resupply. Fleet Patience had not blocked anything. It had not intercepted anything. It had not threatened anything. It had simply arrived in the place where a block, an interception, or a threat would be effortless to execute, and then politely asked everyone to update their transit plans. The Cathansel outer colony governors began filing formal requests for directorate guidance within 4 hours of the navigational advisory. Inside the Cathansel directorate session at hour 30, the strategic calculus was becoming clear to enough senior members that a consensus was beginning to form, not loudly, not through formal deliberation, but through the quiet accumulation of revised positions. The Directorate's senior military advisor, Commander Delegate Voskareth, presented a revised assessment that had been requested 6 hours earlier. It was blunt. Fleet Anvil was not the threat. Fleet Anvil was the visible element, the one that looked aggressive, the one that previous Cathansel modeling had focused on as the primary coercive instrument. But Fleet Anvil required a decision to use it, a decision to cross into Cathansel space, which was an act of war, which triggered obligations under the Conclave Charter, which created exactly the kind of formal confrontation that Terran doctrine, upon examination, appeared specifically designed to avoid. Fleet Patience required no decision to use. It was already deployed. Its mere presence was already creating economic pressure through the behavioral adjustments of every commercial operator in the corridor. Every week it sat there, the resupply situation in the outer holdings degraded by a percentage point. Not because of anything Fleet Patience did, but because commercial vessels, being rational actors, were rerouting around uncertainty. And Fleet Ledger, the medical ships, the habitat modules, the detention law specialists sitting patiently at the edge of Terran space. Fleet Ledger was a statement that the Terran Directorate had already decided the operation was happening. The only remaining variable was whether it happened cooperatively or otherwise. Voskareth's assessment concluded with a single sentence that reportedly produced absolute silence in the chamber. They planned for us to wait. At hour 38, the Cathansel Foreign Affairs Ministry transmitted a formal response to the Terran Directorate's open channel. It was brief and carefully worded to preserve as much procedural ambiguity as possible. Nothing in it constituted an explicit admission of wrongdoing, nothing waived the Cathansel jurisdictional claims, nothing acknowledged that the detention had been improper. It was the kind of diplomatic language that could be interpreted, in future proceedings, in almost any direction. But it confirmed that all detained personnel, 417 individuals, including 11 Terran citizens and the remaining Dravali crew, would be transferred to humanitarian custody within 22 hours, in accordance with conclave protocols for the treatment of civilian detainees. It also, in a subordinate clause that Terran analysts flagged as significant, requested that the transfer be coordinated through Terran logistical assets, citing the prepositioned resources already in the area. They were asking Fleet Ledger to come and do the job it had been assembled and positioned to do. Humanity had not fired a single weapon. They had not crossed a single border. They had not issued a single ultimatum. They had moved correctly, and waited for the galaxy to do the math. With 10 hours remaining on the clock, the math was done. The retrieval itself was quiet, efficient, and almost anticlimactic by the standards of the crisis it resolved. Fleet Ledger arrived at the designated transfer point, a neutral coordinate in the navigational corridor, equidistant from Cathansel space and the Dravali cluster, at hour 52 of what had been a 48-hour deadline that no one in the end had let expire. The Cathansel escort vessels were already there when Ledger's lead ship, the TDS Meridian, completed its fold space transit. The 417 detainees had been consolidated aboard 2 Cathansel transport vessels, which were holding position with running lights at minimum brightness, the interstellar equivalent of a vehicle pulled to the side of the road. The transfer took 11 hours. It was conducted under the observation of 2 independent monitoring teams, including a Velhari delegation that had arrived without announcement and positioned their vessel at a respectful observation distance without requesting permission to be there. Nobody asked them to leave. All 417 individuals were confirmed alive, in reasonable health given the circumstances, and in possession of their personal documentation. The 11 Terran citizens were transferred first, processed by the medical team, and cleared for onward transit within 4 hours. The Dravali crew members were transferred in 3 organized batches, processed by their own government representatives who had traveled to the transfer point independently, and cleared by hour 9. At hour 11, the TDS Meridian transmitted a standard mission completion signal to the Terran Directorate. Fleet Ledger began its return transit. The crisis, as a practical humanitarian matter, was over. What was not over, what was in many ways only beginning, was the conversation happening in the intelligence departments, diplomatic services, and strategic planning offices of 35 civilizations that had watched the entire sequence of events unfold. The conversation had several distinct threads, and they were not all arriving at the same conclusions. The first thread was purely military strategic, and it was happening most urgently in the civilizations that shared borders or contested navigation rights with humanity. The question these departments were asking was not whether humanity had acted correctly. Most of their legal teams concluded the Terran action had been carefully constructed to remain within legitimate bounds. The question was what the action revealed about Terran military doctrine, planning capability, and institutional decision-making speed. The answer in most assessments was uncomfortable. Fleet deployment at this scale and coordination, 3 distinct fleets, in 3 different strategic roles, prepositioned over 11 weeks, all moving on a signal from a diplomatic session that most observers had thought was simply another day of procedural stalemate, required a level of contingency planning and institutional alignment that most civilizations could not have executed. Not because they lacked the ships but because they lacked the decision-making architecture. Getting a government and a defense directorate to agree quietly months in advance, on a complex multi-vector operation that would only be activated if diplomacy failed, and then holding that operational security for 11 weeks without leaks, was the kind of institutional capability that very few civilizations had demonstrated. Humanity had demonstrated it by doing it, without announcing that they were demonstrating it. Several intelligence departments noted, with some professional admiration and rather more professional unease, that the Terran operation had been running in parallel with the diplomatic process the entire time, that every conclave session had been, simultaneously, a countdown. The second thread was economic, and it was running through the commercial networks that connected the conclave's member civilizations in ways that formal political structures often lacked. Fleet Patience's positioning in the navigational corridor had lasted exactly 61 hours before the transfer was completed and the fleet began its repositioning. In those 61 hours, commercial transit through the corridor had dropped by approximately 30%, Not because fleet patience had done anything but because commercial operators, making rational risk assessments, had chosen to wait and see. 30%. 61 hours. 400,000 tons per month baseline. The calculations were straightforward. What was less straightforward was the longer-term question. If Terran doctrine included, as a standard strategic instrument, the deployment of fleets to create navigational uncertainty in commercially critical corridors, what did that mean for infrastructure planning? For resupply dependency? For the economic security of outer holdings and colonies that relied on specific navigational lanes? Several conclave members who had not previously thought of themselves as particularly exposed to Terran strategic pressure began, quietly, updating their vulnerability assessments. The third thread was political, and it was the most complex. The conclave had reconvened 4 days after the transfer, not at full membership, but at a session of the Rules and Procedures Committee, which was the body that had been processing Jose Mensa's emergency session request when she'd walked out. The meeting was, ostensibly, to discuss procedural improvements to the conclave's crisis response mechanisms. What it actually was, as became clear within the first hour, was an assessment of what had just happened and what it meant for the conclave's authority. The Velhari chair, a different individual from the one who had presided over the fateful 43rd session, opened by noting that the Terran action, whatever its merits, had established a precedent, that a member civilization could invoke Article 7, deploy military assets, and resolve a crisis that the conclave's full deliberative process had been unable to address in 9 weeks. This precedent cut in 2 directions simultaneously. On one hand, it suggested that the conclave's crisis mechanisms were inadequate, a conclusion that several members, including the Dravali delegation, were not reluctant to voice. The existing system had failed to protect civilians. A unilateral actor had succeeded where the collective had not. If that pattern continued, it would erode confidence in the conclave's core function. On the other hand, the action had been taken by humanity, currently the smallest, youngest, and least established major member. If humanity could do this, what did it mean when civilizations with considerably more ships, more territory, and longer histories of unilateral action decided that Article 7 was the appropriate response to their next dispute? The Velhari chair sat with this question for a moment after presenting it. Then she said something that was quoted in diplomatic circles for years afterward. The humans did not break the conclave. But they showed us where it was already broken. That is either the most useful thing any member has done in decades, or the beginning of something we will spend a long time managing. Possibly both. The Terran delegation returned to the conclave at the session following the transfer's completion. Admiral Jose Mensa took her seat without ceremony. She had prepared a formal statement, which she delivered in the measured cadence of someone who had written it very carefully and intended every word to land where it was aimed. She thanked the conclave for its continued work. She expressed Terran commitment to collective deliberation as the foundation of galactic order. She acknowledged that the Terran action had been unusual and warranted transparent explanation. And then she said this. The Terran Directorate did not leave this chamber because we believe we can solve the galaxy's problems alone. We left because 11 people had been in a detention facility for 6 weeks, and we had the means to help them, and the process had not. We will always return to the process. We ask only that the process remain capable of acting when action is required. No one in the chamber spoke for several seconds. Then the Velhari chair called the session to order, and the conclave continued. But it continued differently than before. In interstellar politics, the most significant changes rarely announce themselves. There are no dramatic alliance declarations, no ceremonies, no formal documents signed aboard historic vessels. There are quiet bilateral meetings, updated communication protocols, subtle shifts in the timing and content of routine diplomatic exchanges. There are joint exercises scheduled and then expanded. There are trade agreements with clauses that didn't used to be there. In the 14 months following the Mahari Corridor Resolution, 6 conclave member civilizations made changes to their relationships with the Terran Directorate that would not have been classified as formal alliance shifts by any conclave monitoring framework, but which were understood, by every diplomatic service tracking them, to mean something. The Dravali Confederacy was the most visible. Their post-crisis statement, "We have been waiting for someone to move," had been noted by everyone, and they made no effort to walk it back. Within 60 days of the transfer, Dravali and Terran navigational authorities had signed a mutual transit agreement covering 17 shared corridor segments. The agreement was framed as commercial, which it was. It was also, practically speaking, the kind of navigational infrastructure cooperation that made combined fleet operations significantly easier to coordinate. The Dravali had not asked for a military alliance. They had made one quietly in the language of shipping lanes. The other 5 were smaller, more gradual, and in several cases more strategically significant precisely because of their smallness. The Cassivar Collective, a mid-tier civilization of 6 inhabited systems, notable primarily for their advanced atmospheric engineering technology and their position at the junction of 3 major navigational corridors, had been, for the previous century, firmly within the Cathansal sphere of economic influence. Their atmospheric technology was licensed extensively by Cathansal colonial operations. 3 of their 6 systems conducted the majority of their interstellar commerce through Cathansal-adjacent trading networks. Within 3 months of the Mohari Resolution, the Cassivar Collective had opened preliminary trade discussions with Terran commercial representatives. The discussions were framed around atmospheric technology licensing. The Terran colonial program had significant need for exactly this technology, and the Cassivar had been hesitant to expand their licensing base due to an exclusivity understanding with their existing partner. That understanding apparently had recently been reviewed. The Cathansal noticed. Their response: increased licensing fees applied to the Cassivar's existing agreements, framed as a routine commercial review, was noted by several conclave observers as a strategic error of the kind that tends to accelerate the very process it's intended to prevent. Understanding why 6 civilizations would shift their relationships with humanity following a single, carefully limited operation requires understanding what those civilizations had been watching for, and what they had not previously seen. Most smaller and mid-tier conclave members existed in a condition that their diplomatic services understood clearly but rarely articulated publicly. They were positioned within the gravitational fields of larger civilizations whose interests they could not fully control, whose attention they could not always predict, and whose goodwill they could not entirely count on. This was simply the physics of interstellar politics. Large powers had large interests, and small powers lived in the spaces between those interests. The question for a smaller civilization was not whether to have relationships with large powers, that was unavoidable, but which large powers to cultivate and on what terms, and with what margins of security. The established large powers of the conclave, the Cathansal, the Velhari, the 3 or 4 other civilizations that had been shaping galactic politics for centuries, had well understood behavioral patterns. You could model them. You knew what they wanted, what they would tolerate, what they would punish, and what they would ignore. Humanity was new. Humanity was uncertain. Humanity was, in the established calculus, a risk. The Mohari corridor operation had not made humanity certain. But it had demonstrated something that smaller civilizations found unexpectedly reassuring. Humanity had made a commitment, to its own citizens and to the Dravali, and it had kept that commitment with precision, without overreach, and at significant diplomatic cost to itself. The Terran Directorate had put 3 fleets in motion to retrieve 11 of their own people and assist 400 strangers. For civilizations that lived in the spaces between large powers, the question of whether a large power would actually show up when it said it would was not an abstract strategic consideration. Was the question. There was a parallel development happening within Cathansal territory that would not become publicly known for another year, but which was already being tracked, partially, by Terran intelligence services. The Cathansal outer holdings, the colonies and research installations that depended on the navigational corridor where fleet patients had positioned, had, during the 61 hours of the deployment, experienced something their colonial administration had not fully anticipated. The psychological effect of a foreign fleet sitting, without aggression, in the lane that connected them to home, the lane that their food and medicine and spare components traveled, had registered differently on the ground than it had in the abstract strategic models. Colonial governors had filed reports. Colony councils had passed resolutions. Individual colonists had sent messages to relatives in the home systems asking, in various formulations, the same question. What happens if they stay? The Cathansal home government had answered that they would not stay, that the situation was resolved, that colonial security was not threatened. This was true. It had also been true for 61 hours when it might not have remained true indefinitely, and the colonists in the outer holdings were aware of this distinction in ways that made certain assumptions about Cathansal's strategic invulnerability harder to sustain. The internal Cathansal political dynamics generated by this awareness would take years to fully develop. But they had begun. Admiral Osemensa returned to Terran space following the conclave sessions, conducted a series of internal debriefs with the Defense Directorate, and then did something that surprised some of her staff. She submitted a formal request for a 6-month position as an instructor at the Terran Defense Academy, teaching a course she proposed to call Escalation Geometry and the Limits of Deliberation. The course outline was approved within 2 weeks. 47 students enrolled in the inaugural session. a combination of Defense Directorate officers, foreign affairs personnel, and 3 students who were, unusually for a Terran Academy course, diplomatic attaches from other conclave member civilizations who had requested observer status. The 3 observer students were from the Dravali Confederacy, the Kassavar Collective, and a small civilization called the Hethari Assembly whose relationship to humanity had previously consisted of cordial formality and very little else. Osemensa's first lecture, later reconstructed from notes by several of those present, apparently began with a simple question. What is the minimum force required to change an assumption? The question was, on the surface, a military doctrine question. It was also something considerably broader. In the 14 months since the Mohari Corridor, the galaxy had been watching humanity for the answer. The answer, it was becoming clear, was not a number. It was a decision, about when to move, where to position, and what to make unavoidably visible to those who needed to see it. That decision, made correctly, changed the calculation. The galaxy was beginning to take notes. 18 months after the Mohari Corridor resolution, Cathansal naval construction output increased by 31%. The increase was not subtle, not concealed, and not intended to be. The Cathansal had always been a civilization that believed in the communicative value of visible capability. Their military history and their diplomatic tradition both emphasized that the demonstration of strength was itself a form of deterrence, and that civilizations which obscured their capabilities were either weak or deceptive, both of which were, in their strategic culture, forms of the same problem. The construction increase was, in this tradition, a message. The Terran Directorate received it, analyzed it, and spent approximately 3 weeks in internal deliberation before producing a response that was, by the standards of interstellar strategic signaling, highly unusual. They published their analysis. Not internally, publicly. In a formal document distributed to all conclave members and released through Terran commercial information networks, the Terran Strategic Relations Office produced a 40-page assessment of Cathansal naval expansion, its likely timeline, its probable doctrinal purpose, and its implications for conclave stability. The document was detailed, professional, and almost entirely accurate. It was also, in ways that the Cathansal found deeply aggravating, respectful. It consistently referred to Cathansal strategic interests as legitimate, characterized the expansion as an understandable response to a changed strategic environment, and declined to assign malicious intent to any specific program. It then offered, in its final section, a series of observations about what the expansion would and would not achieve. The observations in the final section were the reason the document was still being quoted in strategic studies programs 15 years later. The Terran assessment argued, with supporting data, that the Cathansal expansion was optimized for a specific scenario: a direct, declared conflict with Terran naval forces in or near contested corridor space. In such a scenario, with defined boundaries, clear objectives, conventional force-on-force engagement, the expansion would, within 4 years, produce a Cathansal force capable of contesting Terran superiority in that specific theater. This was a legitimate strategic objective. The document said so directly. It then noted equally directly that the Terran Directorate had no intention of fighting that scenario. The Mohari operation had not been designed around the possibility of direct Cathansal naval engagement. It had been designed around 3 considerations: the deployment of assets that created economic and logistical pressure without requiring kinetic engagement, the maintenance of legal legitimacy under conclave charter, and the completion of the humanitarian mission before any conventional military confrontation could be forced. A larger Cathansal fleet in corridor space did not change any of these 3 considerations. It changed the cost of a direct engagement, which was a cost the Terran Directorate was not planning to incur. The document closed by noting that the Terran Directorate remained committed to conclave collective security mechanisms, and that the most effective response to the strategic uncertainty created by the Mohari incident would be strengthening those mechanisms, not parallel bilateral buildups. It expressed a willingness to engage with Cathansal counterparts on this subject and provided a formal point of contact. The Cathansal response to the document was complicated. On the official level, their Foreign Affairs Ministry issued a measured rebuttal that characterized the Terran assessment as presumptuous, incomplete in its understanding of Cathansal strategic doctrine, and in any case premature given that the expansion was ongoing and its final configuration remained undetermined. The rebuttal was professional and largely substantive. Within the Cathansal Directorate, the response was considerably more fractured. The military expansion advocates, the faction that had driven the construction increase, found the Terran document useful primarily as evidence that humanity was attempting to constrain Cathansal military development through diplomatic pressure, and used it to argue for acceleration. A second faction, smaller but not without influence, found the document's analysis unsettling for reasons that were harder to articulate in directorate meetings but were understood by everyone who read it carefully. The Terran Directorate had, in public, demonstrated that they understood Cathancel's strategic planning well enough to identify its limitations, and had chosen to share that understanding rather than exploit it. This was either a gesture of good faith or a demonstration of confidence so complete that good faith was indistinguishable from it. Either interpretation was, in different ways, concerning. The third faction, the one that had been most affected by the practical consequences of fleet patience in the corridor and the subsequent economic adjustments, was now arguing internally that the expansion was addressing the wrong problem. The Mohari operation had not succeeded because humanity had better ships. It had succeeded because humanity had made better decisions, faster, with more institutional coherence, and had positioned those decisions within a framework that made them nearly impossible to respond to conventionally. Building more ships for a conventional engagement was a response to a war that humanity had specifically designed their operation to avoid fighting. This third faction did not win the internal debate. The expansion continued. But they continued making their argument, and the Directorate continued listening to it, and both of these facts were noted by Terran intelligence services with professional interest. The development that shifted the strategic environment most significantly in this period did not come from either the Cathancel or the Terran Directorate. It came from the Conclave's Rules and Procedures Committee, which had been, since Ose Mensa's walkout, working on a comprehensive reform package for the Conclave's crisis response mechanisms. The reform package had been 18 months in development and had involved representatives from 21 of the 37 member civilizations. It proposed, among other things, a new expedited process for civilian protection emergencies that could be activated by a simple majority vote rather than the existing consensus requirement, an independent monitoring corps with authority to conduct welfare checks on detained individuals without requiring host state consent, and a revised interpretation of Article 7 that clarified both its conditions and its limits. The Article 7 revision was the most contested element. The Cathancel opposed it on the grounds that it institutionalized unilateral action. Several other members, including the Velhari, argued that without clarification, Article 7 was a permanent source of instability, any member could invoke it under any interpretation, and the Mohari precedent had demonstrated that the invoke could be made without formal conclave approval. The Terran delegation supported the reform package in full and had, in fact, contributed substantially to its drafting through back-channel consultations that only became publicly known after the vote. The package passed by a margin of 24 to 13. Cathancel voted against. Terran voted in favor. The Dravali, the Kassavar, and the Hethari Assembly all voted in favor. So did 11 civilizations that had never previously voted with the Terran position on any substantive conclave matter. The vote was not a strategic alliance. It was not a declaration of alignment. It was a procedural reform package about committee processes and welfare monitoring. But 24 civilizations had looked at how the Mohari corridor resolved, looked at the alternative, and decided which model of galactic order they preferred. Ose Mensa, who had completed her teaching appointment at the Defense Academy and returned to an advisory role within the Strategic Relations Office, attended the vote remotely. She made no public statement. A junior member of her office apparently asked, after the results were announced, whether this felt like a vindication. Her recorded response was brief. It feels like a beginning. Which is the same thing measured from the right direction. 2 years and 4 months after Admiral Yara Ose Mensa walked out of Conclave Session 43, a Cathancel junior diplomat named Rethsaval, 26 years old, 3 years into her foreign affairs posting, assigned to the Conclave's newly reformed Crisis Response Monitoring Corps, submitted a training exercise report that became, in subsequent years, something of an unofficial document in the study of the period. The exercise had required her cohort to analyze the Mohari corridor sequence as a historical case study and answer a single question. What was the decisive moment? Most of her cohort selected the obvious candidates. The walkout. The fleet deployment. The 48-hour notice. The Cathancel Directorate's decision to comply. Rethsaval selected none of these. She argued that the decisive moment was 11 weeks before the walkout, when the Terran Defense Directorate had begun prepositioning Fleet Ledger, the humanitarian transport fleet, the one carrying doctors and habitat modules and detention law specialists, without any public indication that the conclave process was nearing its end. Her argument: the commitment was made when the doctors boarded the ship. Everything that followed was execution. Her supervisor gave her paper the highest mark in the cohort and added a note that read, "This is the correct answer. Remember it." The galaxy had, over 2 years, been doing its own version of the same exercise. The strategic recalculation that the Mohari corridor operation had initiated was not a single event with a clear conclusion. It was an ongoing process, moving through different institutions at different speeds, producing different conclusions depending on the interests and frameworks of the civilizations doing the calculating. For the Cathansel, the process was painful and still incomplete. Their naval expansion had continued and was producing the additional fleet capacity their military planners had projected. But the internal political dynamics that the Mohari incident had set in motion, the outer colony governor's quiet anxiety, the third faction directorate members' persistent questioning of the expansion's strategic logic, the economic realignment of civilizations like the Kassavar who had previously been within the Cathansel sphere, were forces that fleet construction did not address. The Cathansel were a powerful civilization with ancient institutions and significant strategic depth. They were not destabilized. But they were navigating a period of internal recalibration that their directorate had not fully anticipated, and several of its most thoughtful members were aware that the recalibration had been initiated by a civilization they had classified, until recently, as a minor power. For humanity, the 2 years had been an exercise in managing a reputation they had not entirely chosen. The Terran Directorate's Strategic Relations Office produced a careful internal assessment 12 months after the Mohari Resolution, surveying how humanity was being perceived across the conclave and what behavioral changes that perception was producing in other civilizations. The assessment was, in the words of its lead author, cautiously concerned. The concern was this: the Mohari operation had been planned and executed to achieve a specific, limited objective, the retrieval of detained civilians, through carefully calibrated means that remained within legal and diplomatic bounds. It had been designed to demonstrate capability and resolve without claiming dominance or establishing permanent coercion. But perception, once formed, is not always granular. Several civilizations had not drawn the conclusion that humanity had made a precise, limited, legally grounded intervention. They had drawn the conclusion that humanity was a civilization capable of decisive unilateral action and willing to use that capability when it judged the situation to warrant it. This conclusion was not wrong. It was, however, missing the precisely when it judges the situation to warrant it qualifier, the part that required understanding the specific institutional and ethical framework within which Terran decision-making operated. Without that qualifier, several civilizations had begun treating humanity as a wild card, powerful, capable, unpredictable. This was useful for deterrence. It was potentially dangerous for everything else. The assessment recommended a sustained diplomatic communication effort to make Terran decision-making frameworks more transparent, not to diminish the Mohari precedent, but to ensure that what the precedent actually meant was understood more accurately than what it was feared to mean. The Conclave's Crisis Response Monitoring Corps, the body created by the reform package that humanity had helped draft, became operational 14 months after the Mohari Resolution, staffed by representatives from 18 member civilizations and operating under a charter that incorporated the Article 7 clarifications that had been so contested. In its first year, the Corps deployed 4 monitoring missions to 3 different situations involving detained civilians or disputed territorial claims. None of the 4 missions involved humanity. 3 resolved without incident, the civilians being released through direct negotiation facilitated by the monitoring presence. 1 escalated into a formal conclave inquiry that was, for the first time in recent memory, resolved through the expedited process within 3 weeks rather than the previous average of 6 months. The chair of the Crisis Response Committee, a Velhari diplomat who had been one of the reform package's primary architects, said in her year-end report that the Corps had, in its first year, demonstrated that the conclave could act with reasonable speed when its mechanisms were properly designed to allow it. She did not mention the Mohari corridor in the report. She did not need to. Admiral Osei Mensah testified before the Terran Civilian Oversight Committee at the 2-year mark, as part of the Directorate's regular accountability process. The testimony was public, recorded, and widely distributed. The committee chair asked her, toward the end of the session, whether she believed the Mohari operation had been the right decision. She said yes, without hesitation, and explained why. The operational objectives had been achieved, the legal framework had been maintained, the precedent had been limited to the specific circumstances that warranted it, and the longer-term institutional consequence, the conclave reform, had produced mechanisms that should reduce the likelihood of a similar crisis requiring a similar response. The chair then asked the harder question. If those mechanisms failed, if a similar crisis arose, if the conclave was again unable to act, would humanity do it again? Osemensa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That depends entirely on whether we've done everything possible to make the conclave work first. If we have, yes, we would." She paused and then added something that was not in her prepared testimony. The goal was never to show that we could act alone. The goal was to create conditions where we don't have to. The Mohari operation was a failure of the system that we found a way through. The measure of whether it was truly successful is whether the system gets repaired, not whether people remember that we found the way through. The galactic recalculation, in the end, was not a single revised entry in a threat database. It was not a repositioned fleet, a changed alliance, or a formal diplomatic realignment. It was something quieter and more durable, an updated answer to a question that every civilization in the conclave had been asking about every other civilization since the first two species made contact across the dark. When it matters, really matters, what do they do? For the Terran Unified Defense Directorate, the answer was now part of the record. They had positioned their doctors before they sent their warships. They had built their case before they moved their fleet. They had given the other side a way out before they closed the door. And when the door needed closing, they had closed it. The galaxy had looked at this, considered it, and in its various ways, across its various institutions and cultures and strategic traditions, arrived at a common recognition. Humanity was not the most powerful civilization in the conclave. They were not the oldest, not the largest, not the most experienced in the long art of interstellar politics. But they had demonstrated, once, under pressure with consequences on the line, that they could execute a decision from its quiet beginning to its careful end, and make the execution look, from the outside, like confidence. It was, by any measure the galaxy knew how to apply, enough. It was, by the measure humanity applied to itself, a beginning. Both things were true. The calculation had been made. The galaxy moved on to the next question.